Can you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. As you said, I'm Emily. I'm 36 and from Mississippi. I'm the director of marketing for a local beverage distributor here. And, you know, in my spare time, I really enjoy traveling, and as of late find ourselves at the T-ball field, you know, just spend time with family and, you know, go about daily life.
Well, let's talk about patients and families with XLH, and especially that journey to diagnosis. You know, we realize rare diseases. When I talk to residents about rare diseases, I have to say, hey, if you don't think of the diagnosis, you're never going to make it. And that is sort of you know, something that really has to stick with you in medicine. The flip side is, from the patient's perspective, is often they want to tell the doc, hey doc, you might not have seen the disease, but the disease has seen you. And that goes to this idea that making a diagnosis in a rare disease is a journey. It's a journey. So let's talk a little bit about that idea of a journey, and can you fill us in about your particular journey to the diagnosis of XLH?
Yeah, how much time do you have, actually, though? It's kind of a long story. And, you know, keep in mind, this is it's my personal experience, and it differs a lot from other people's experience. But I would say one of the key things was when I was just a toddler, my paternal grandmother, and that's the side of the family that XLH runs in for us, she had noticed, I had slight bowing. I didn't have a huge, very pronounced, you know, bowing issue, but a little bowing, and she told my mom that, you know, you need to talk to her pediatrician. She might have rickets. And my mom said, oh, okay, I'll bring it up. And so my mom did. She brought it up with the pediatrician, and the pediatrician at the time proceeded to just kind of laugh in her face like, she doesn't have rickets. That doesn't really happen anymore. You know, and that was even in the late 80s, you know, and so that was one, you know, point where this could have been diagnosed, and it didn't. And then, you know, fast forward to when I was about 9 or 10, I was very active, played soccer and softball and basketball, and at one point when I was rounding the bases in softball, I just fell to the ground. My kneecap had dislocated. And, you know, that it became a much more common occurrence. It didn't just happen when I was playing sports, and so had to see an orthopedic surgeon then, and ended up having surgery on both my knees at the age of 11. And they even did genetic testing then. That was back in 1998, and it was inconclusive. They didn't find anything. So again, undiagnosed. So even when I was into adolescence and working a job in high school, at a place that's popular for their fresh squeezed lemonade, and my hands hurt, and I saw our family doctor, and just like, my hands are, you know, they kill me. Just like my bones are aching, and he said, oh, you're just not used to working. You know, it's nothing. Don't worry about it. So a lot of times that there was a chance to possibly look further into that why, what are these issues, or what's causing these issues, and it didn't happen. So it didn't come until much later at age 33, and it wasn't even because of something that one of my doctors found. It was because of my daughter, and she had very bowed legs, and that was when we realized, you know, something's not quite right, and I kept looking into that, you know. So
I'll fill the audience in on rickets. We're both familiar with rickets, but rickets is sort of a general term for a childhood disease that you can imagine if your bones don't grow quite normally, and sometimes I use the analogy that your bones are, you know, they're like a concrete structure with rebar and cement. The cement, the calcium and phosphorus, if there's a problem with your calcium and phosphorus metabolism, the bones don't grow normally. They can tilt to one side, or you can't build that building to the final height. And we'll touch upon it that, you know, rickets is the childhood disease, but we'll make sure that as we continue this hearing about your journey, that the journey doesn't end after you become an adult. In fact, the journey continues. So what finally led to that diagnosis of XLH? Because I can imagine, you know, you must have looked at your daughter and thought, oh my God, how can I go through this again? I've been through all this stuff, and now as a parent, You always want the best for your kids.
For sure.
You're their advocate. Tell us a little bit more about how you what finally led to that diagnosis.
Yeah, so I believe I mentioned something around at her 9-month appointment. She had the extreme, or, pretty prominent bowing at that point. She had just started pulling up. It's not like she was even walking yet, but that was when the bowing had really, become noticeable. And anyway, nothing, oh, don't worry about it. Brought it up again at the 12-month appointment. Was told again that she'll grow out of it. It's no big deal. Of course, I'm Googling, trying to figure out, I wasn't satisfied with that answer, and found that like 95% of kids that have bowed legs grow out of it, and it's nothing. And so I shouldn't think about this. Well, it progressively was getting worse and worse. And at her 15-month appointment, finally was able to get an orthopedic referral for her, but it wasn't until a couple months later. So in between getting the referral and having that appointment, I was still searching, and was actually in a Facebook group for a different disease that I thought I had or may have. Not sure, it doesn't have a genetic marker, but I shared a picture of her bowed legs and a little bit of the background, and somebody commented and said, "Have you looked into genetic rickets?" Huh. And from that moment, then I started that Google search again, much to the dismay, I'm sure, of a lot of doctors doing that Google search. But ended up coming across X-linked hypophosphatemia and seeing the XLH network website with a little girl. She had on floral leggings and just looked exactly like my daughter's legs. Huh? And from that moment, like, I knew, but then what really solidified that for me was, had also been talking a lot with my family. My family had lots of, varying issues with bones or, joints and, that type of pain and things like that. And I remember my aunt telling me that her husband, that's my dad's brother, that one of his doctors had written down a suspected diagnosis on a Post-it note for him, but they hadn't pursued it. And she said, "I'll have to find that one day." And so when I found XLH, I sent her a text message that next morning and said, "Does that Post-it note you told me about, does it say X-linked hypophosphatemia?" And she said, let me see if I can find it. And a couple hours later, she sent me the picture, and sure enough, that's what it said. Huh? That's what it said, and that was just when I knew, like, okay, this is what we're dealing with.
Wow.
So.
Who was the doctor that finally said to you, okay, that said, yep, you're right, you figured it out? Who was that?
So on that same Post-it note was the name of 2 doctors in Missouri where they live, and so I did a lot of Googling again, and happened to find one of the doctors was, a specialist with XLH, and found his email address, sent the pictures and the story, and I honestly was just asking, who could I find in my area? And that was about 2 weeks later. I hadn't heard back or anything, and then it just so happened to be on my birthday. I got a call from his office saying, "Hey, can you come up to Missouri to see us in 2 weeks? Would that work with your schedule?" And of course, I jumped at the opportunity. Amazing. And so that doctor was a geneticist.
Wow. Wow. So speaking of genetics, XLH is a genetic disease. You're born with it. Mm-hmm. Now, in most of the cases, in 80% of the cases, we can kind of look at the family and sort of trace, we look for a particular pattern of inheritance. We can go back to great-grandparents, sometimes even further to find it. Occasionally, in 20% of patients, it will be a new or novel mutation, and they start off, and they'll end up passing it on. I gotta commend you, give you some kudos for your persistence. And sort of one of the amazing things about your persistence is that, and this also goes back to this idea of being an advocate when you have a rare disease, whether you like it or not, but all of a sudden, you've made this connection, you've come up with this diagnosis. What was it like telling other family members? And then can you comment on, I know you've when we've talked before, you've mentioned that sometimes different family members have different symptoms. So I'm curious about how you then disperse the knowledge to the rest of the family. How did that go?
Yeah, you know, we like I said, we always kind of knew that the family, bad joints, bad, just, you know, from the hips down, we've got problems. And so we actually have a like private Facebook group, family Facebook group, where, you know, we discussed different things. And so I made a post on there, and we also happened to have an in-person event for my grandfather's 90th birthday a couple years back, where everybody, because we're scattered all about the country, and just about everybody was there. And that was right after that realization moment I had before the actual appointments, but when I knew, you know, and discussing everything, and you know, talking about everybody's symptoms. I had created I think it was like 3 pages long on Word, a document of every family member and what symptoms they've had or what issues they've had, and it was 5 generations worth of stuff. And actually, so that call on my birthday, the very next day was the orthopedic appointment for my daughter, and I took all that to her and I said, here, this is what we have. I know it. I just know it. And I've gotten the call from this other doctor to come see them, but I wanted to go ahead and come see you. And she still told me that, no, it's just physiologic. There's nothing. The x-rays look fine. It's no big deal. But then 2 weeks later, take those same x-rays up to Missouri, and he says, well, no, this here is where her bones are fraying at the ends, and here's more, you know, classic markers of XLH for her. So, you know, just kind of got that vindication that I was right. I wasn't, because I was really having serious issues thinking, okay, maybe I'm not right. I thought I had cracked the genetic code for our family. But anyway, then did get that vindication that I was right, and then passed that on to family members and was able to kind of coach them on how to talk to their doctor, what tests to ask for, because, you know, they even though we had at that point received the genetic testing that it was in fact XLH, I've got some uncles who are over 6 feet tall, and they said, look, my doctor kind of laughed at me. They said, you don't have XLH. And then they were shocked when the genetic test came back that they did. Yeah. So
that's tough, because, you know, when we talk about genetic diseases, there's a genotype where we kind of read the genetic code and we said, okay, here's a problem area, but that doesn't always reliably translate into a very specific phenotype or how the disease manifests. So we see this wide, sometimes we see these wide presentations of a similar genetic defect. I think one of the interesting things is also to bring up is that a lot of times when we mention the word rickets is a childhood disease. So you said, well, I had rickets as a child, so then you're done with the disease when you're an adult. And we recognize with bone disease that just isn't the case. And so I'm going to show you from the East Coast. We have I-95, which is just sort of notorious for, you know, being torn up and rebuilt. Like 10% of that road is always under construction, always under construction. And that's the way your bones are. They're actually fairly dynamic. So even after we built this house or built the skeleton, it's still being turned over. And you can imagine in a disease like XLH, where basically there's not enough phosphorus to go into the bone, that once you tear up that part of the road or tear up that part of the bone, you go back to fix it, well, you're not using the proper cement. And so we have to remember that these bone diseases are lifelong diseases. They're progressive, lifelong diseases. One thing I'll also mention is that as you're growing up, you build your bone density to a peak in your late 20s, early 30s, and then unfortunately, Father Time slowly takes some of that bone mass away. So you can imagine if you're growing up with a bone disease, you don't hit that natural peak.
Right. And
so then when you start to fall off, you might have symptoms that you would expect to happen much later in life. And that's a perfect segue for you to describe sort of what have your symptoms been like, how they transitioned over the years.
Yeah, you know, I mean, as I mentioned, I had extensive knee issues as a kid, and so that was what I thought were my main symptoms, in childhood. And, just as I've gotten older, like you mentioned, that just was a huge realization when you said that, yeah, like in my late 20s, that was really when things really did start to go downhill, from heel pain to hip pain and back pain, and like you said, things that you just don't expect to experience in your late 20s or early 30s. And you just kind of wonder, what's wrong with me, or is this all in my head? What's going on,
Tell us about some of the, one of the things with bone disease that's under-recognized is pain, and sort of with pain comes sort of tiredness, exhaustion. Did you find that creeping into your life? Did you look across, and see your peers having, you're like, why could they do that and I couldn't? Did that ever come up?
Yeah, but I thought it was just because I was working full time and a mom. Yeah. I didn't realize it was because I had this genetic disease. But like they say, hindsight is 20/20. I can think back now and realize that, yeah, even when I was a kid and active and playing these sports, I would play in a soccer game and then I'd get in the car and drive, 20, 25 minutes home and try to get out of the car, and I look like an old lady trying to, get up and start moving and have to kind of almost warm up to walk.
Yeah.
And just, that was my normal. I didn't realize that was...
in some ways, it was also your family's normal, right?
Right. Yeah. And I
really
saw my dad.
For hereditary disease, right? Huh. Well, let's briefly talk about one of all of our favorite subjects, the dentist. Because we know in XLH, your teeth are bone, and often you can have very significant dental disease in XLH. So can you tell us a little bit about what's going on with the dentist?
For me, right when I did get diagnosed, I thought, okay, this is one of the symptoms that I have skirted by. I don't have those issues. I didn't have any cavities as a child or any major issues with my teeth. And then somewhere, in the last 2 to 3 years, it's just fallen apart. I bit into a granola bar one morning and was chewing and then thought, I think my tooth just broke.
Oh my goodness.
And then sure enough, that's definitely a part of my tooth right there. So had to get, a crown. I've gotten quite a few crowns and root canals now, and so I didn't avert that one.
Yeah. All right, we'll move on from the dentist. One thing I wanted to explore with you was this idea of being an advocate. In treating rare disease, I've found that often I've learned more from my patients than I have necessarily from a textbook. And what's unique is when I look at patients with rare disease, you realize whether they want to or not, they have to do a lot of education to the caregivers around that. What's it like? I mean, you seem to be a natural at it, but I'm kind of curious what it's like to have that, to do that. And, I'd also like to have you, talk to some of the people out there. What's it like to be, how do you advocate in a way that you build positive relationships with the caregivers out there?
Yeah, it of course depends on the doctor. There are doctors out there that don't want to be told that you might know a little bit more than they do. But there are doctors also out there who are willing to learn and don't mind hearing more about your experience with something or what you've learned from talking to others with the disease, and take that into account as to how it's affecting you and your care plan. It's just you've got to kind of fight your battles, or pick your battles really. There's one doctor I saw that he fixed my issues that I had, but he just wasn't really concerned with why they were happening. So, didn't really explore anything else there. But then I have, the main physician that manages my XLH. He admitted to me, I don't know everything about this disease, but I'm willing to learn. And he reached out to some professors from his college career and has really taken an interest in making sure that he's helping me manage this disease. And so you've got to, know that you might not find the right doctor the first time, and don't just take the first answer you get. Do a little more research, find another doctor, see, get a second opinion, get a third opinion if you have to.
Yeah. I mean, your story is also a lesson. You come from a family, you've identified over 20 other family members who have XLH, and it was really your persistence that worked out for everybody in the family, and that's the power of advocacy, right? That where you're persistent and you can see where it really pays off